Hi, good morning, everybody. Morning, everybody. Come on, right? Yeah. Who's happy to be here at 9 a.m. this morning? Well, listen, thanks for coming to this session. I know there's a couple of others going on at the moment that you certainly could have chosen, so thank you for coming here. I'm Greg Taylor. I'm a program manager in the Exchange Customer Adoption team, which is part of Office 365 Customer Experience. My team and I, Ross and Brian Day, and I work alongside Jeff Mealiff. We produce a whole bunch of random guidance, deal with a whole bunch of customer escalation-y stuff. And my particular area of interest has always been client access and security and publishing and those kind of things. So how many of you ever heard me rant either at MEC or TechEd about why you don't need firewalls and stuff? And how many of you took that advice and now don't have firewalls? That's a lesser number, but there are still some, and that's great, all right? And so, I've talked quite a few times about increased security in the product and all the things that we've done to increase security and why firewalls are less necessary than they were some time ago. And but the reality is we still have more complex publishing requirements, and that's because we have IT security teams. Not because we need more complex publishing requirements, but because we have IT security teams who tell us that we do. And so I kind of thought, well, we should talk about some of those more complex scenarios. And so the question really is, how many times have you heard this? Now, the symbol to the top right, I don't want you to draw any conclusions of the picture of a bull at the top right here, okay? Don't think there's any relation at all. But how many times have you heard this? Because I hear this quite a lot. You can't let the data get on the machines we don't own, and you have to use the VPN, and, why we're not opening up any more ports in our firewall, etc., etc. Now, these are often thrown at you, and your job as the Exchange architect, implementer, whatever it may be, is to try and solve these requirements, keep the security guys happy. Now, I kind of have this view that, and I often get into discussions with security teams at companies, and I do so on a regular basis. I was on one last week. And I have this view, and I always say to them, well, IT security's job is to allow you to access your data securely, not just to secure the data. Right? I mean, we're in the business of, most organizations are not in the business of IT security. They make cupcakes or pencils or something, right? Equally important. And so people want access to their data in order to be able to make better cupcakes and longer pencils, or whatever they do with them, okay? And so the security guy's job should be surely to let them do so in a secure manner, rather than just say, cut off access, and therefore we are secure. So I'm not going to go too far down that path, but I'm sure some of these requirements you've heard, and you've probably wondered how you can do those in Exchange. So what I'm going to ramble on a little bit for this morning is common requirements, and we're going to level set a little bit and talk about some of the options that you have available and a little about security in more general terms, and some of the options that you've got to solve those fairly simplistic problems. But I'm also going to dive into a few more complex requirements that I sometimes hear and what options you might have in order to be able to solve those requirements. Sounds like a plan? Awesome. Wearing a Microsoft band today. You're at a big event when by 9 a.m. it buzzes and says you've met today's step goal. It's like, man, this is a big venue. All right, so let's get going here. So what are some of the more common requirements that you get? So pre-authentication. Pre-authentication is, it has been the standard way to secure Exchange from the internet for, well, awful long time. And the reason for that was that Exchange and Windows, let's be honest, were not very secure out of the box back in the olden days, right? And so, when you had Exchange 2000 running on Windows 2000, you frankly needed to put something that was designed as a security appliance or in some way, shape, or form in front of it. Well, times have changed, right? And so, I've talked before about things like the Trustworthy Computing Initiative and Secure Delivery Lifecycle, and about how Microsoft has fundamentally changed the way we develop software so that even a tiddly little feature like those I've done in the Exchange product go through full security reviews. And so even though you may not think there's any risk associated with your feature or radio button or whatever it is that you're working on within the Exchange team, you have to do a security review. And that is consistent, and it means that we are designing and building our product from the ground up to be more secure. And so now we feel like we're in a place where we can do it, and that's why I've talked about it before, but I'm not going to dwell too much on that for the moment. But here's another thing that's kind of interesting, the hybrid aspect. How many of you are doing Exchange in hybrid mode? Great, all right? And some of you, and more of you, will probably be doing so at some point, I'm sure. Well, pre-auth in hybrid is a little more, well, it's just different. Because the service, meaning Exchange Online, is making requests into your system. It's the service making a request, not a user. So the whole user must be pre-authenticated concept goes out the window because you're really authenticating a service, not an individual user. Right? So users looking up FreeBSD in the cloud, it's actually Exchange Online that's making the request on that user's behalf. So it's different. You've just got to think of it in those terms. You can't quite always apply the same concepts. So here's another one. Nothing can reach the internal network. So my first response is typically like, you have a big security team then? A big network team? Multiple layers of DMZ. Who's got that? I bet some of you have. Because it's great. Keeps lots of network equipment to look after. Definitely going to need lots of networky people if you've got that. That's good. And lots of security stuff. So you probably have, you have big security and network teams, right? So putting multiple layers in could be argued doesn't add an awful lot of real benefit other than you're certainly adding complexity. There's no question about that. I think most people would answer that. And you add complexity because you have to figure out how on earth your application is going to work, getting through these multiple layers, and how's the routing going to work, and what's the default gateway for all of these things, and all of that stuff, right? That adds to the complexity. But quite often I see that really all that's going on is SSL termination, decryption, and routing, and nothing else. I mean, we'll look at the SSL packets. That's what they tell you. Yeah, we're going to have a deep look at the SSL packets. They have no idea what an Exchange SSL packet should really look like. ICERT and TMG and UAG have no idea what a real Exchange packet looks like. All they're really looking for is, does it conform with standard HTTP standards and conform to the protocol? They're not really doing anything more than that. And so really you're not really understanding the traffic, but you are, to be fair, you're guarding against some network-based attack type stuff, IP spoofing, a bunch of other stuff that goes on. That's something you certainly can guard against, and that's okay, but does it warrant the additional complexity? That's really the question that has to be asked. Asking lots of questions. We'll try and answer some in a little bit. Who's heard that you've got to have two-factor auth solution? I'm sure there's a good number of you there. If I had T-shirts, I'd throw them out, but they didn't give me any this morning. Now, quite often I hear, well, you have to use the insert vendor solution here, two-factor auth, as opposed to you have to have two-factor auth. Now, there's a difference between the two. When the security team say to you, you need multi-factor or two-factor auth, whatever terminology, essentially that's the same thing, that's a different statement than you have to use this solution that we bought, which is harder sometimes to achieve, depending on the application, in our case Exchange. That can be often pretty tough, because Exchange is not currently, Exchange and Outlook are not natively two-factor aware and savvy, so that's a bit tricky. And so what I typically try and push back on is, well, is the requirement really multi-factor or two-factor auth, or is it, is that the requirement? Yes. Well, what if we can meet that requirement by not using your solution and using something else? Ooh, no, we can't do that, right? That's the response you normally get. But when you push and, you say, well, we can do Exchange with multi-factor auth. We certainly can. You can do it. You're just not going to do it with a solution that you happen to have chosen. It makes for an interesting discussion. You can see some of these go on and on and on. But, the key thing really is to sort of push on the requirement of multi-factor rather than the predetermined decision that this is the solution you have to use. And so to really, you know, the way to show the security guys that you have some idea, you know, it's, if it's two-factor auth, it's something I have and something I know, or something I am. Brackets, really, I guess. And so if, you know, I pose a couple of questions. So if you use a certificate for authentication of a device, for example, or the user, and you secure a device with a PIN. So the solution here I'm thinking, you know, is an ActiveSync device where you use cert-based auth and a PIN to unlock the phone. Is that two-factor auth? Well, by the definition that we agreed upon, something you have and something you know, I would say so. What about providing a certificate and a username and password? I mean, these are two-factor auth solutions, right? The answer is yes to these. They are multi-factor or two-factor auth. Once you get out of the, we've decided here's the solution you have to use, and more into the what it is we're trying to achieve discussion, I find this an awful lot easier. Here's another one you hear. Yeah, well, only machines that we control and own are allowed to access the data. I'm sure some of you have that hard requirement. Well, this one, the industry is shifting, right? The days of, you know, the fleets of company-issued laptops with asset tags on them that IT set up with an image for you and shall not be changed are disappearing largely from our industry. Absolutely, some of you, I'm sure, are still in that world. But the bring your own device kind of shift the industry is taking, where people can go buy whatever they can feel like buying, is changing the way we have to think about things. And the security guys need to consider this too. And when we design solutions, you know, this is the thing. Now, MDM is one of the routes that we can take in that way. But typically, MDM solutions these days are they're certainly more aimed at mobile and tablet devices, the MDM solutions that you see. But what about corporate-owned, and it's always Outlook, right? Corporate-owned Outlook, full Outlook on a laptop or from home. How do you secure it so that only data gets onto the machines with Outlook that you own? That's kind of often the requirement. Or you hear well, you have to use the VPN because we built this really expensive VPN solution, and it's really expensive. It's not really awesome. It's just really expensive. We invested in this heavily, so obviously you'll have to use it. VPN solutions, variable, right? But some pretty painful for the user who has to deal with it. And the thing that always strikes me in my response to that typically is, well, when you connect with a client with a VPN, you're able to access the entire network. Okay, you can secure it and lock things down. But if you do a fairly standard, typical deployment, you VPN in, you've got access to everything. Not just the application you're trying to get to, which is mail, but the entire network. And so by adding a VPN endpoint, you could argue you're actually decreasing security because you're opening up applications that the user's not really trying to get to. I know some of these you can argue both ways, right? But that's the point of this. It becomes a discussion rather than a mandate that you have to comply with. Now, what about segmenting the network? How many of you have got security or network people that want to put firewalls up the wazoo, right? Yeah. And they want to put them between servers, cut a server in half, put a firewall in the middle. Right? Quite often see network diagrams that are done by the security or network guys, and there's multiple tiers and data layers and all of this. And they want to put Exchange in the DMZ. Seen that one? I had an email about that one yesterday, actually. Customer wants to put CAS in the DMZ for their 2013 deployment. And my first thought was, wait till I see Exchange 2016. Because that's not a path you want to head down, is it, really? Given that there will be no standalone CAS role in Exchange 2016, not perhaps the right long-term strategy. So, but here's the key thing about this, because we get this quite a lot, which is I've got firewalls in place, I want to throw firewalls all over the place. We don't test, nor do we support, but primarily because we don't test, putting firewalls between Exchange and Exchange or Exchange and AD. Our developers are told they should not expect any port restrictions or shaping of traffic between Exchange, and Exchange and AD. And so they are free to do whatever the hell they want in terms of adding ports and communication paths. I mean, they don't do so willy-nilly, right? And it'll all go through security review, like I was saying earlier. But the point is they're not constrained by some arbitrary, you must do communication only over these ports mandate. They have the ability. And so the reality is that if you put firewalls between servers and they are not open up the any fashion, any exchange to any exchange and any exchange to AD, you at some point will probably fall foul of the traffic shaping that's going on and something will stop working. And so if you notice, we didn't publish a paper for 2013 Exchange on which ports you need to open, ports and protocols. Did anyone notice that? I bet a few of you got pretty annoyed by that. We're not going to do it. We're not publishing the paper because the moment, I mean, do we know the data? Of course we know the data, right? I mean, that's not hard. But we don't want to publish it because it simply leads you down a path of, well, the Exchange team have published the list of the ports we need to open, therefore that's what we will open. And then come the next cumulative update or the next whatever it is, change, stuff can change and stuff will break, and it always does. And that's the point at which my team usually get involved. So we get to see quite a lot of broken stuff. And here's the other thing as well, which is make sure you have a backout plan. So, I mean, I do have customers that despite that warning, they say we are doing it anyway. Stuff you, Microsoft. We are going to put firewalls in and open up ports, and we're going to monitor them. We're going to put them in kind of, a tracing mode, if you like, figure out what ports and protocols you use, and then we're going to create some rules to control the traffic to only those ports. It's quite a lot of ports and protocols. There's quite a lot of communication going on. But they kind of somehow feel that must be more secure, and so they do that. And then something goes wrong, because something changed, or they missed one, or they misconfigured it, and I've seen that too. And so our advice is there, if you're going to do this, have a backout plan. You need a way to be able to remove that junk from the network communication path. Otherwise, when you call support and you say, I can't, mount a database, or this information is not available to the client for whatever it might be. There might be or I'm getting a weird error in my event logs. If we trace it back to, well, that's because you're blocking ports between servers. Why are you doing that? Oh, no, we're not doing that. That's the first answer you always get. I guarantee you that, right? Didn't change anything. Nope, nothing at all changed. You dig a little deeper, it changed, right? And so if you don't have a way of backing that out because your network infrastructure is so rigid and these controls are in place, we end up in a really difficult position because we'll try and reproduce the problem on the support engineer will try and reproduce the problem without all that stuff, and everything works great. Don't put yourselves in that position. You really have to push them hard on our support position. By doing this, do you realize Microsoft will not support our Exchange deployment? And if the security guy says, I don't care, then you go tell the people that manage the business. Say the security team are going to put Exchange in an unsupported position by giving us this configuration. And then I stand back at that stage and let them just fight it out. And then we end up, hopefully, in a happier place. All right, what about the policy argument? So, it's in the policy, you're not allowed to do that. I know some of you may have heard me talk about some of these things before, but we will get to the fun stuff, I promise. Well, fun stuff, right? But honestly, I've actually been involved in quite a few projects. Before I worked in the engineering team, I was in Microsoft Consulting and at a partner before that. And I worked on projects where Exchange design, AD design, everything's going great. And then the security guy takes a look at it and he says, you can't do that. It's against the policy, the security policy. And you say, well, where is this fabled policy? I've not seen this fabled document. And he's like, oh, here it is. And you say, well, I don't see anything about that. And he turns around and he writes in, you are not allowed to do this. And then you're like, oh, right. And I know that sounds, I absolutely swear that happened to me once. I'm not kidding. And it taught me a valuable lesson, right, like all of these things should, which was, ask what the policy is first before you tell them what it is you want to do. right? What's the policy? And then you design your solution, if you can, to meet the policy. And then when you have the pushback, that's the way to do it. Don't let them, give you the policy afterwards. That never works. And, you ask about how they're securing access now. You try and dig in to get as much information as you can. I know I really give, security guys particularly, I give them a hard time, but I genuinely don't. They honestly understand a billion times more about network or computer security than I do. I am an Exchange guy. I dabble in this. They are far smarter than I am. But what they often, I find, tend to forget is that we're trying to go back to the statement I made early on. We're trying to enable secure access to the data, not just secure the data. Their job should be about helping people get to the data in a secure manner. All right? So they're only doing their jobs. So the way, I tend to use tricks as well about making sure they think you know what you're talking about. Used to do this with storage back in the days when storage was really important to Exchange. When you talk to a storage vendor, a SAN vendor, if you can roughly in your head, and I used to be able to do this when I had youth and hair on my side, I used to be able to randomly sort of figure out what the IOPS requirements and how many spindles you might need for a particular deployment. Only because that was the kind of thing the MCM and Ranger program used to teach you to do in your head, because it was cool or something. And so, when you're talking to the SAN guy and you go 70 disks-ish, something like that, and they look impressed. Might have just pulled that number out your backside, right? They honestly don't know that. But if you're... So, digressing slightly, right? That's always my style. So, authentication versus authorization. I find most people use these terms interchangeably. Anyone ever guilty of that? I suspect probably so. But they're not the same thing. And so if you make sure you understand the difference in these basic concepts and other things like this, you get credibility with the security people that you're trying to work with. And at least, even the basic stuff like this, it helps them realize that you kind of have some idea what you're talking about. So I always like to think of it in terms of, on an airplane, your passport is your authentication. It proves your identity. Authentication is about proving identity. And authorization is about proving what you're allowed to do. So your boarding pass. I'm allowed to get on the plane, but my authentication was my passport. And so in computer terms, authentication is providing credentials or a certificate or something that shows your identity. And authorization are the ACLs or the RBAC permissions or whatever it else is that controls what you're allowed to do once you are authenticated. And I know for some of you think, it's obvious. I guarantee some of you in the room will probably not have realized that the two are not the same thing. And we use them interchangeably. Try not to, because it kind of helps just make clearer conversations, I always find. So the word risk comes up quite a lot. Oh, that's a risk. We're not going to do that. That's too big a risk. And so I did a little bit of thinking about how do you look at risk? And risk is a widely used term that gets thrown around as the common objection to why we won't do this in terms of publishing Exchange. But risk is, and I'll read this to get it absolutely correct, is the potential result of what happens when a threat takes advantage of a vulnerability. I'm going to have that tattooed on my arm here, right? But the threat is the something or someone that can do the damage. Understanding these terms is good, and I have another slide that kind of shows, because I had a conversation about somebody quite recently where this came up. So the threat is the someone or the something that's trying to attack you, okay? The vulnerability is the thing by which they can get in to do so. What it is in the software or your configuration or your choices that you've made that allows them to do so. And the risk is the possibility of that happening. And it's a multi-dimensional problem, right? So risk is a combination of these factors. Now, you may not have control, and you certainly don't have control, I would say, over some or all of these factors. The threat. If you have control over the threat, that probably means you're working in one of our security services, and you are eliminating the threat using other means. But threat is so this is how. So here's how I kind of think about this. So you've got these different factors. And so you have a discussion, and I had a discussion with somebody quite recently about we want to go to move our mailboxes to Office 365, we need to go into a hybrid state. We want to go into a hybrid state. You don't need to go into a hybrid state. Small organizations that go into hybrid, you're doing it wrong. Seriously. We end up with a whole bunch of small organizations that could do a cutover migration. I know I'm digressing, but this is kind of, I think, important information, right? We end up with a bunch of small companies that do a migration or a hybrid, go into hybrid, they move the mailboxes and they leave the hybrid stuff up and running when they really don't need to. And you end up in this legacy long tail of hybrid when there really isn't any need. Simple cutovers are much easier for smaller organizations, hybrid for larger organizations, long-term coexistence. But anyway, we were having this discussion about, well, you've got to open up these ports through the firewall. Now, as you probably know, or hopefully know, you can't pre-authenticate the connectivity from Exchange Online back into your on-prem environment today. And so you have to allow these SSL connections. Now, they can be reverse proxied. You can break the SSL and bridge it from a device in the network and allow it in for what value that is, except that it'll allow your highly convoluted multiple-layer network to work. But it doesn't really give you any security value at all. But you have to allow this traffic in unauthenticated. And well, the authentication is in the token within the HTTP streams. And here's a difference as well, that with these kind of more modern authentication protocols, we're moving from authenticating at the HTTP layer to authenticating within the data stream or the packets itself. That's where the tokens are. So you have to allow the HTTP to come in on its own. And they were saying, this is too risky. We are not going to open up any ports on our firewall for the purposes of moving mailboxes. So, well, okay, look at it from a few different ways. You look at it from this code security. There are things about, and these are very arbitrary, badly colored blobs. The template was a killer on colors this time around, right? But the code security is a bubble, and you really don't have an awful lot of control over that. That's the thing that we control within Exchange itself. But then you also have this intersection of time. So it's not that the code is entirely exposed all of the time. You are defining a migration window or a period of time in which you want to have this configuration. And so you overlay the fact that it's only you're reducing the risk to the overall code security, perhaps, by controlling the window of time. And then let's say you have a network security device, whether it be just this, network-based denial of service type stuff, or smarter network intrusion detection software that you might have, which is looking for more network-based attacks. And you overlay that on top of it as well. And then you might say, well, plus we do monitoring. And, the security team that put in a security device, and then you ask them how it's monitored, and they're like, oh, yeah, it will tell us if there's a problem. Think, yeah? All right. That's pretty confident of it. So, but you have, hopefully, monitoring going on here, too, because you can only really establish secure, publishing of applications like Exchange if you really monitor it as well. I would hope that's obvious. And the point being that there is this black hole of intersection in the middle here, where the combination of all of these things, that's the risk. Not the whole big kind of picture. People get stuck in the whole big picture of any time we open up anything, it's going to be disaster. Well, it's a combination of all of these different factors that goes to mitigate the risk that is commonly expected or seen or identified. And so there's the argument that I sometimes have, which is, look at it in different terms. I agree with some of this is probably a whole load of hocus, but it's about trying to get the conversation going to a point where it's a positive discussion and we go forward rather than we just give up. All right, so let's have a delve back into what some of these publishing choices are. What do you have? So this is the one I've talked about. I talked about the last MEC and there and a tech ed, which is you don't do security devices at all. Now, this is actually our starting point. This is our preferred architecture for publishing Exchange to the internet. Because we sincerely believe that Exchange and Active Directory are actually secure enough that you don't need to put what you would classically call firewall devices or network security devices in front of it. Now, for those that, at the beginning I asked the question, quite a few people had seen me. I'm only going to talk about this just for a few minutes, but for the benefit of the rest of you that haven't seen this, we actually run Office 365 like this today. And we also run our internal dog food deployment of Exchange, our on-prem deployment. There are no firewall devices in front of either of those. For the on-prem environment, it's a load balancer. In fact, really for both. It's a load balancer with one arm on the internet and one arm on the inside. And you come through the load balancer and you hit Exchange. And it's been like that for a long time. In fact, I'll tell you a small secret as well, that even when we had ASA and TMG, some of you may longingly remember those products, we didn't actually do pre-auth ourselves in our own MSIT internal deployment. And the reason for that was policy. I'm going to give you this one. This is awesome. This is a great story. So what actually happened was in the original version of ISA, digressing slightly, right? In the original version, of ISA, you couldn't do forms-based auth and basic auth on the same listener, all right? Maybe a couple of nodding heads. You couldn't do that. It was introduced in TMG. Now, in TMG, what it essentially meant was you could have one namespace, mail.microsoft.com, and if you were using a browser, when you hit that TMG listener, you'd get a form. But if you were using Outlook or ActiveSync, you would get a basic auth prompt. Now, you couldn't do that on ISA. It wasn't able to do that. And so the decision was made that it was more important to have a single namespace, mail.microsoft.com, than it was to have pre-authentication. And so mail.microsoft.com, when we had ISA server way back, just tunneled all the traffic all the way through to Exchange. Does that surprise anyone? Never did pre-auth. Just did SSL bridging. Now, when TMG came out, and we changed, or TMG was able to do both forms and basic, nobody changed anything, because it was working just fine. And the policy was, this is how it's going to be, so this is how we shall do it. So in fact, we never had pre-auth in front of our own internal deployment. Probably quite scary to some of you, the idea of that. But we have a whole bunch of nerdy developers and security people who watch it and would figure out if there was a problem and fix it. And so many of the security improvements we've made probably came as a result of people trying to get into Microsoft, which I'm sure has happened. Now, Office 365 has no pre-authentication either, but that's also a factor of scale. There really isn't any, unless we decided to build ourselves a solution for that, there really isn't a way to do that in Office 365 at scale. And so those things combined, they lead you to conclude that Microsoft had to figure out a way to make Exchange running on Windows more secure. Otherwise, we would be the victim of an awful lot of attacks and problems. And clearly, we are a popular target, and we do get our fair share. But that's why we secure the code, right? And I'm not telling you, no word of a lie. That is the way we do it. I hope that gives you some slightly warm and fuzzy feeling. But bear in mind, even though when I said take out the firewalls, I don't mean don't watch what's going on. You still have to watch what's going on. You don't really know there's a problem. If the time you know there's a problem is when your users are unable to connect, you're probably a little bit too late to the game. So, taking out those things, good patching, policy, keep security updates, watch the hell out of it, etc., you can do it, and we've been doing it for a long time. Now, I do have customers would love to move this way, but it's a journey, and I get that, and I'm not going to say this is the only way you should do it. I think this is a good way to start, but it's a journey, and some customers will never get there, some customers will get there, and some already have by the sounds of it, which from earlier, which is terrific. All right, so if you're not going to take that approach, the commando approach to security, then you have a bunch of choices. So let's just run through some of these choices. So you've got TMG, UAG. How many of you are TMG and UAG users? How about UAG? Just UAG. How many of you have got UAG? Okay. Well, hopefully you know by now that we've stopped actively developing both. We are no longer selling. or actively developing. I think actually UAG, I think we may still be doing some patching and stuff, but they're not products that Microsoft is taking forward. However, both of them still work. And I often have the discussion that, or the question is asked, well, now you've killed TMG, UAG, and we're publishing Exchange, what shall we replace it with? Right? Very common question. And my first response is always the same. Is it working for you today? Yes. Well, then don't feel like you have to just throw the thing out just because we stopped selling it. It's supported. In the case, they have we have the life cycle thing, but it gives you a chance to think about what is the next strategic move I want to make. And often as well, as an Exchange guy, I have to force myself to ask the question, on what else are you publishing on your network? And it's not just an Exchange problem. I'm a little bit selfish, right? I always think it's just an Exchange problem. But often the device or the application being used is being used for lots of different things, not just Exchange. So I have to try and remember to ask the question and respect that too. But the key thing is that just because we stop selling it doesn't mean you have to get rid of it. Use it as a kick up the butt to say, now we're going to figure out what we want to do long term and make some decisions. Now, one of the options that comes up is Web Application Proxy. So WAP, awesome name. And in fact, commonly used like all over the place at Microsoft at the moment. We have, I had a conversation with somebody the other day, I think it was at least 2 minutes, till I realized he was talking about the Windows Azure Pack as opposed to Web Application Proxy. Well done, marketing. So, but the on-prem, so the Web Application Proxy, is a role or service within the Windows Server 2012 R2 product, and it is for publishing applications on an internal network. And the team actually that wrote UAG, the UAG team actually are the people that are responsible for all of that. So that's where a lot of the smarts came in there. Now, it is not a firewall device. It is a publishing and authentication service, if you like. And it does give you the ability to do ADFS, pre-authentication for OA. In fact, the only pre-authentication it offers right now is OA. And so you can't do pre-auth for Outlook Anywhere connections or for ActiveSync connections or for hybrid connections. Now, that's on their plan and their roadmap, and in fact, I've been involved in helping them test a whole bunch of work that they're doing. So it's definitely part of their roadmap, and Windows Server 10, I think, is going to be the vehicle in which they ship pre for all of those other clients and protocols as well. Now, another interesting one is Azure AD Application Proxy, which is application proxy in the cloud. And I'm actually going to talk a bit more about that a bit later. So rather than dig too deep in there, the same publishing capabilities available in the Azure cloud, which is kind of cool. And I'm going to show you an example of how you could use that a little bit later. Now, ARR, the pirate's favorite SSL bridging device. And is anyone using R? And do you have to speak like a pirate every time we say anything about it internally? Yeah, awesome, great. That's part of this. Now, ARR, and I don't want to break your heart here for those of you that put your hands up, but we really don't think you should be using ARR at all. Sorry. There's no pre-auth. It does bridging, right? I mean, it works. I'm not, as a reverse proxy that just simply gets traffic from A to B, it works. There are some challenges. For example, if you enable caching on the ARR device, as opposed to not, which is what we recommend, you may see somebody else's mailbox in OA. Now, that, I would agree, is a bit of a security risk. So make sure you turn off caching. Hopefully you already have, otherwise people are reading your email, and you just don't know. But that can happen, right, because of the caching algorithm that's in ARR. Now, ARR was a kind of a bit of a garage project from some people in the IIS team. And so the Windows Server team, there really isn't any support. There's no development on it, that's for sure. But it is not an actively encouraged solution that we want to try and push you down that path, I would say. So it works, it can solve a purpose. There's also the load balancing vendors as well. And the load balancing vendors, have come up with some interesting and creative solutions as well to offer pre-auth. Now, I was saying earlier, you could just use a load balancer in front of Exchange and let Exchange do all the auth. But the load balancing vendors, finding a gap in the market once we killed TMG, figured, well, we can add pre-authentication logic to our load balancers for those of you that want it. And they're good solutions too, right? So you can look at those if really that's another option, or it's another option that you have available to you. But you can also look about tackling, locking down security. I've done a picture before that, IT security is like an onion, and it makes you cry as well, like, peeling an onion. Because it's multi-layered. You don't just put this pre-authenticating firewall in front of Exchange and say, I'm off to the beach, I'm done, this is easy. There's other things you can do, and there are other things you could do in place of that firewall. For example, one of the most commonly overlooked ways of securing access to the data, so that only people who should get to it can get to it, is using setcas mailbox and set virtual directory. Setcas mailbox, it's a bit of an odd one because you've got the set mailbox parameters for the mailbox object itself, and then you have another command like called setcas mailbox for client access connectivity to that mailbox. But in setcas mailbox, you can turn on and off ORAct or EWS stuff and a whole bunch of different active sync. You can turn on and off a whole bunch of different stuff. Outlook Anywhere is a little trickier with 2013 Exchange, and I'll come to why in a second. But you can use the commandlets and the parameters there to enable features for some users and not for others, and secure your environment if your goal is some people can do some things and some cannot. That could be one way of doing it. You've also got built-in support now with Exchange 2013 SP1 for OA and ECP. We added in-product support for ADFS. Have any of you deployed the ADFS OA solution yet? For the purposes of the recording, everyone put their hand up. For the people in the room, that was about 2. So, and I'm not surprised, right? Okay, it's not the default way we want you to set things up typically, but you can certainly do it. You can use ADFS, and you tell Exchange where to send the users to go get their token, and they go off to ADFS. Where you can at ADFS require other forms of authentication. The user authenticates to ADFS, they come back to OA, present a token, and you're off to the races. And you can use Web Application Proxy in front of that too, and have WAP actually be the guy that's intercepting the clients and telling them to go get a token. Now, Smart Card Outlook Anywhere is another way of doing it within Exchange itself. Is there anyone who's done the Smart Card Outlook Anywhere solution? Wow, one. Excellent. All right, it's hard work, isn't it? Yeah, there we go. I've been very involved in that solution over the last few years, and it's painful to configure. But if you have the requirement or infrastructure requirements to be able to do it, you can use a smart card and a certificate to authenticate to Exchange for Outlook Anywhere. Now, multi-factor auth, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, or sorry, modern auth is really the term that we're calling it, and there's a session on that also at the event as well. I'll come back to that. Certificate auth. Exchange has had the ability to allow you to offer a certificate as a form of authentication for OA and ActiveSync for a long time. Now, it's not really Exchange, actually. It's IIS that you really tell to accept certificates. And Exchange, it doesn't really know you're offering up a certificate. Typically, it's because that's dealt with at the IIS layer. But you can use that, and particularly if you have a certificate that's secured with a PIN, does that become a two-factor auth solution? I have a certificate and I need a PIN to unlock it. Something I have and something I know. Oh, look, you can actually do two-factor auth on OA and have been able to for years. Admittedly, it's not a common solution. And certain auth, and I talked about that earlier, which is you could present a certificate and then provide credentials. And this was actually really easy if you had something like TMG in front of Exchange or a network security device. Because the network security device could be told to request a certificate for the incoming HTTP connection before it allows the publishing rule to be accessed. And in TMG, you would just do require a certificate to authenticate and then do regular publishing delegation. And the experience from the user perspective would be You hit mail.microsoft.com whack OA, for example. Not that we ever did this, right? But as an example, you provide a certificate. Once you provide a valid certificate, then you get the forms-based auth login page. Something you have, a cert, and something you know will be your credentials, two-factor auth. Okay, other ways you can do this. Other ways within Exchange or the application layer. IPsec, I'm going to talk more about IPsec in a second, and MDM. And so MDM, there's a multitude of solutions out there, benefits and caveats for all of those. But lots of people are moving to an MDM-based solution, but there are some networking requirements as well for being able to reach cloud services and stuff with MDM that I know at least one customer at this event has been having challenges with. But there's another way you can add additional layers of security without necessarily adding firewalls, which is not the route we want you to take. All right, so let's look at actually addressing some of these more complex, weird, wonderful solutions. So the first one that we get is the you have to use two-factor auth. So here's your security mandate. You have to use two-factor auth. Let's talk about the ways you can address it. And I've already talked about a whole gamut of them as we've gone through here. But let's try and just dig a little deeper into some of these perhaps. So the hardest part, as I said before, is agreeing what it means. So let's focus, if you remember, on what it means, something I have and something I know, or something I am, in case of biometric security. Right? So biometrics, think about something I have and something I am. My eyeball, I pop it out and I pop it on a little reader. Can only do it once, or twice actually, really, I suppose. And then that's it, I'm locked out after that. I've got no eyes left. Right, anyway. So here are some ways to do that. Now, there's one way I would say you do not do this. And published. People always find, one thing I love about this kind of area as well is creative solutions. People think that IT people are boring and have no creativity. I think it's actually the complete opposite. Because I think a good IT person is creative, right? You have this set of requirements. You have to figure out how I'm going to make this thing work. And people come up with the most creative ways of making it work. Some of which are awesome and supported, and some of which are not. And this is one that's not. And one of these that is not, for example, but I have seen steps on how to do this, is the Azure MFA, put an Azure MFA server on-prem, hack around inside OA essentially, so that OA or the virtual directories hand off authentication to Azure MFA. And whilst you can get that thing working, I wouldn't suggest you take that approach because we don't test that, Exchange. Azure may think it's the most awesome thing in the world, but Exchange doesn't. And who are you going to call when it all goes wrong? Not Ghostbusters. You're going to call for Exchange support, and Exchange are going to go, no idea what that is. You should probably take that out. See if you can reproduce the problem then. You go, no, it works great. Well, there you go then. Right, okay, there's your answer. Sorry, but that's the reality. All right, so the certificate and the credentials. Now, I mentioned about TMG. You can do this on the TMG listener. You request a certificate, and then you pop up the form for auth. You can also do this at the load balancer or security device. Whatever device it is that's terminating the SSL many of them can be configured for TLS certificate security on the HTTP connection itself. So the user has to present a cert at the HTTP layer. Now, that's great. Once they get that certificate that allows them to negotiate an SSL connection with the load balancer, then the HTTP layer, they're authenticated, and then the traffic continues, and then they have to provide authentication to the application that is being connected to or published. And that's fine. That's all good. Problem is, often with this solution, OA's fine because you get pop-ups and prompts. Outlook, not so fine. Outlook's a real bear when it comes to trying to force it to, pop up credential prompts and everything else. It's not very easy to configure. In fact, I think it's probably impossible to configure a solution for Outlook using this type of solution or an answer, to get Outlook to work. So ADFS, so I touched on this already, but just dig a couple more points here. So we added it, and you can actually, even though we added support for ADFS into the Exchange itself for 2013 SP1, you can, in fact, use it in a coexistence environment. So if you move the front-end namespace to Exchange 2013, which is what you would do in a 2010-2013 coexistence scenario anyway, if the 2013 SP1 servers are set up for ADFS, you actually get ADFS for 2010 as well. Because all the users are coming into the 2013 CAS, and all the connections are proxy back. So that actually works too. You can actually, so if you're a 2010 Exchange user and want ADFS for OA, there's a simple way to do it. Put Exchange 2013 CAS in front of all Exchange 2010, and you can actually turn on ADFS. There's another way to do it. Or WAP. Okay? Now, the key thing with this solution is to grasp the concept that it's actually not Exchange doing the authentication, it's ADFS. And so whatever authentication requirements and scheme you've configured on ADFS is what the user has to go through in order to be able to get access to Exchange. Exchange just sees a token coming back from the user. He has no idea whether you provided an eyeball or just a smart card or anything else for authentication. That's entirely up to the ADFS thing. OA and ECP only, and like I said, you can use web application proxy. The Smart Card Outlook Anywhere solution, which one of the people in the room has done, this, if you've ever tried it, I mean, if you're ever bored on a rainy Thursday afternoon, right, and you're feeling particularly good about yourself, try and set this up, and it will bring you right back down to earth again. It's tough to set up. And it's tough because the requirements that it has essentially are, this is a one switch for everyone type of configuration. You run a script, you change a bunch of properties on the virtual directories, you have to do a bunch of stuff in NetSH, the network command line tool, to change some properties in IIS. And if you're lucky, and it's like you're wearing the right color shirt and it's a Tuesday or something, then maybe it will work the first time, but it's highly unlikely, to be perfectly honest, right? But one thing we've done in 2013 is you can use virtual smart card. So the TPM-based virtual smart card technology, you can use that instead of as well as a physical smart card now. Now, the link at the bottom here is to the documentation that was published on Monday. You won't find it when navigating down the tree on the left-hand side of TechNet, because frankly, we don't really want you wildly going out and trying to try this configuration. The customers that really want to do this know about it or will find it, hopefully. But it's not a common solution. But it can be used to solve complex multi-factor auth publishing scenarios. Now, this is the route we'd rather you take, which is something called modern authentication. And don't you love it when Microsoft would come out with a term like modern public folders? What's the next version, what's the next iteration of public folders going to be called? I mean, more postmodern. A postmodern apocalyptic public folders. That is not an official name for the next version of public folders. Right, anyway. But this is the route we'd rather you take. The challenge is for on-prem, and I'm thinking about on-prem deployments here in this session, it's not, you can't get it to work yet. You don't have the right bits. But the Active Directory Authentication Library, which is what all of this is being built on, is common across the Office client apps. And so you'll have this within Word. It's the same logic within Word and Excel and PowerPoint and Outlook. And so Outlook essentially becomes like the browser ADFS type solutions, becomes a redirectable client. And so you head off to Exchange. It's configured for this. And you're going to need Windows Server 10 ADFS, which is why you can't get this solution working yet, for support. Outlook goes, talks to Exchange. Exchange says, give me a token. Outlook says, oh, dude, I don't have a token. And Exchange tells them where to go in a polite way. Outlook heads off to the ADFS or STS endpoint, performs whatever magic the ADFS endpoint requires for authentication, gets a token, comes back, presents it to Exchange. Easy. What could possibly go wrong? I'm sure it will take about 30 seconds to set up and you'll be good. Right? No, it actually should be pretty straightforward. But we're already doing this in Office 365 already, as I'm sure many of you already know. Bringing it to on-prem has a few other complexities, not least of which is you need Windows Server 10 ADFS, which is not currently available. Next year, I think, isn't the release. I'm not sure. Whenever the release of that is, that's the final missing piece. We actually have the code within Exchange, obviously, today. Otherwise, it wouldn't be working in Office 365. And Outlook is capable of doing it too already today. And tenants are, on a preview basis, able to do this within their tenant in 365. On-prem coming. John O'Luck, who's the PM for all of this, is doing a session, where are we? Thursday. Tomorrow afternoon, Modern Auth for the Office clients, if you're interested. And he's the guy driving as well the work that we need to get in order to be able to bring this to on-prem. Now here's another requirement. So only certain people are allowed to access Exchange from the internet. Now this one's, with Exchange 2013, has been harder than previous versions. And with previous versions of Exchange, you would use the set cas mailbox commandlet, the one I referred to earlier, and you would turn off RPC HTTP mode, essentially. You turn off Outlook Anywhere. So then when they were inside the network, it would be MAPI RPC. And when they were outside, it's RPC over HTTPS, or MAPI RPC over HTTPS, to be more technically correct. And then you turn off Outlook Anywhere. And then Autodiscover doesn't return the Outlook Anywhere settings to the client, and the client can't connect from outside. Okay? Now, the problem with 2013 was that we're using RPC inside and outside the network. So you can't just turn off Outlook Anywhere unless you don't want them connecting internally either, which is not generally a good idea, right? Might be fun to play with for a little while, but it's probably not going to work. So the only real solution when this one came up, and it comes up relatively often, not terribly often, was a pre-authenticating firewall, because then you can selectively choose which users can come in through the outside and which cannot. But honestly, that was not a nice place to be. And so Exchange 2013 to the rescue. So what's happening in the next CU is we're bringing a new capability to Exchange 2013. And I think Ross hinted this a bit in 2016, but we're doing this in 2013 in CU10, I think. So we've added some parameters. So you can enable or disable MAPI HTTP and Outlook Anywhere on a per user basis. But here's the key thing to grasp. They're only in the Autodiscover code. They don't actually block the protocol from being used, because you can't really block Outlook Anywhere for a user from outside the network, but allow it inside, because it's still Outlook Anywhere, inside and out, right? You have no... Exchange has no real idea of directionality. So we block it in Autodiscover by saying don't return the external settings. But here's the one thing you have to think about, is in order for this to work, and we covered this in the preferred architecture yesterday as well, is you need different namespaces inside and out. Because if you use the internal namespace on the outside as well, then if you don't return the external settings to the client, the internal ones are going to work anyway. You understand? Right? It's a bit of a weird one to get your head around, but you need different namespaces for Outlook Anywhere inside and outside. And then you can not give the external Outlook Anywhere settings back to the client. That's a good way of solving it. So there's a nice complex table in a true developer-based fashion, which means you've got nulls and trues and a random combination of settings will end up with these results. So for example, the organizational-wide setting of MAPI HTTP down the left-hand side, when it's true, and then you have individual user settings being either null or true or false, and null or true or false, there's the response that you get. And that table will be published and available. And my slides aren't on the thing yet, but they will be, and you have this slide deck later on. But that's a nice way for then finally being able to have some control over who can access the service from inside or out. But like I said, remember, it's only an Autodiscover thing. Really savvy users can just figure stuff out like this and put a local XML file in and do all kinds of stuff. That's the stuff I do for fun. Create an XML file and tell Outlook to use it. All right, so the third requirement of 4 I'm going to go through is the, well, you are not allowed to get the data onto unmanaged machines. The ones with the asset tags on, right, typically. So as we said, that, as I said before, that the BYOD stuff is changing how we look at this typically. And given the number of operating systems, combination of devices, and all of these stuff, it's getting harder for those organizations that want to be very rigid. They're giving people less and less choices. And that's okay, but it's their choice, but it's getting harder. So the MDM stuff, not so good for Outlook. So the way I would approach this, I typically will rather than pick a solution, which is an MDM type product or service, rather than pick a solution, pick something that's vendor agnostic. Pick a technology rather than pick a solution. And you can pick one here that meets the two-factor auth requirement. Now, the two-factor auth requirement, or the solution I've got in mind, or the technology is IPsec. Now, IPsec is hard, but security people love IPsec. And do you know why they love IPsec? Because nobody understands how it works except them. At least they think so. That's absolutely true. I remember having a discussion with a customer, and we were talking about the Smart Card Outlook Anywhere solution. They had this exact requirement. This was a few years ago. So, well, you could do it with direct access, right? So, in fact, another way you could do this, just thinking about this, direct access. You could do it with Smart Card Outlook Anywhere. I said, or you could do it with IPsec. The security guy on the other end of the phone, I thought Christmas had come early for him. He was like, ooh, that's a great idea. Yeah. And that's what they did, right? Now, IPsec, you probably are familiar with the term. You might not be too familiar with its implementation. But here's what it gives you. IPsec is securing at the network layer between two devices or machines, whatever term you want to use. And so it's securing at a layer below the application layer in the stack. Two machines are allowed to talk to each other or not, and IPsec is the determination. So what that means is, if these two machines can negotiate an IPsec security association, they're allowed to talk to each other, and then the user can work. So the question is, how do you figure out if these two machines are allowed to talk to each other? Well, that's where the policy comes in and the configuration settings. So this solution can work with domain-joined or non-domain joined machines. It all depends how you get the authentication device, which in this case will be a certificate, and the right configuration, which in this case is a policy, onto the devices. It's also not version specific. It doesn't matter whether you're on Windows 8, 7, 6, 5, or any of those versions that never came out. You could even do this with Linux or Mac. You can do it. We don't care, because IPsec is an open standard protocol. It's not a Microsoft technology, which the security guy thought was awesome too, because most of those are like everything Microsoft's ever written is completely insecure. So therefore, and that, I'm sure you've probably heard, I get that quite a bit as well, and that's fine. So an open standard, they love that kind of stuff too. And it's two-factor. It's something you have, which will be the machine has a certificate, and something you know, which is your credentials to log into the machine, and then potentially credentials to log into the application. What do you need to do this? You need a PKI. Now, the fun thing about installing a PKI, and most organizations probably have one, badly implemented, right? Because the cool thing about PKI is it's 30-second implementation, typically, but 6 months in the planning. Right, to do it right, there's a few things that go into it, but it's kind of the culmination of all of that work the security people put in is next, finish. And they're like, we're cool. It's like, you filled in a wizard. Well done, boys. Group policy objects are how you're going to get in a domain join environment these policies and certificates distributed to the clients. You can distribute in a domain joined environment machine certificates to the clients. Now, you also need a degree in nerdiness, because this is, this is heavy underwater stuff, or you need to read a good white paper, and it just so happens we have a good white paper on this particular subject. And so this will explain how to set this up. It actually talks about using TMG and UAG, I think, or TMG UAG in front of Exchange. But it's applicable, honestly, no matter what kind of security device or network device sits in front of it, because it's the same technology. Now, how does it really work? You get a certificate onto the client machine, and you have a corresponding certificate, or you put a certificate on the receiving endpoint, load balancer, firewall, whatever it may be, and you then create a policy. Now, the policy can be configured on a Windows box, and you can do this on other operating systems too. It's all just the same, right? But in a Windows environment, you have the security policy, which you can distribute via GPO, and you configure some settings. And as you can see here, You've got the destination IP from the client side will be the IP address of the endpoint it's connecting to, the destination port, TCP 443, and a certificate, and the corresponding policy, the opposing policies on the other end. Now, once you have this in place, and you open up the browser, let's say, and TMG is producing a form at the other end, you open up a browser, you get form-based auth. And you're thinking, what happened? Nothing happened. Well, in fact, everything happened, but it happened at a layer below you and what you're doing. So it happened a bit like this. You've got traffic. That is a little picture of cars and stuff. So there's actual traffic. Network traffic as seen on the wire, traveling backwards and forwards, up and down the stack and across the network wire at the bottom. Now, when you put an IPsec policy in place, what happens is the traffic gets intercepted by the IPsec driver within the Windows stack in this case. And then the two machines begin to set up a thing called an Internet Key Exchange. They have a common certificate authority. They negotiate a security association between them based on the properties of the certificate and the policies that you've created, which then forces IPsec encryption or optionally, or IPsec authenticated connection between the two, optionally encrypted, but not necessary because you're already doing SSL between the two. And then the traffic is actually across the wire, going across an IPsec security association. The client sees the form pop up, they log in. The machine has been authenticated to the endpoint. If you don't have a certificate on the machine and the endpoint requires that you have requires that you present a certificate, you get page cannot be displayed. You just can't connect to the endpoint. You get nothing. Pretty cool. What's also cool about this is it works for Outlook and OA and ActiveSync. You're all mesmerized by the cars going backwards and forwards. I can tell, right? But it works for all of those clients invisibly to the user. User doesn't have to do anything, but you have authenticated the machine and the connection. All right, so crazy requirement number 10. We're down to just a few more minutes left. Let me see if I can get through this quickly. Here's one I've heard. We're not going to open up any inbound ports on our firewall, but we want to have access to Exchange from the internet. The David Copperfield solution, as I like to call this one. Now, I'm going to whiz through fairly quick because there's actually another session going on at the event, or I think maybe it was yesterday. Let's find out. So VPN is not the answer. It's not a VPN, so that requires an inbound port. The answer is something called Azure AD Application Proxy. And you can do this with the Azure AD Premium or Basic, but you only get the multi-factor also options if you have Premium. And this is an OA solution only. Now I'm going to show you this because in Exchange world we tend not to look too far sometimes outside of other things that go on. So I think it's important that you know about this one, keep it in the bag. But this is kind of interesting. This team as well are looking to add. In fact, you can route ActiveSync traffic through this path, but not Outlook anywhere currently. But this is something they're working on. Now here's how this works, right? At a high level, user on the left. On-prem deployment on the right, Azure Cloud in the middle. So what you do is you have an Azure AD tenant, and if you've got Office 365, you already have an Azure AD tenant, and you enable something called the application proxy. And I'm going to show you how you do this, and if I have a few minutes, I may demo it. If not, I'm not sure if I have time. Or I'll show you the screenshots of this. You then, and here's the key thing. If there's one thing you remember about this is the most important thing. You install a connector device, a connector service on a machine running Windows Server 2012 R2 inside the corporate network, and it makes an outbound connection through the firewall to Azure, authenticated. It's an outbound connection. We're not opening up ports coming back. It's an outbound connection, right? The client, you publish an application within Azure. The client talks to Azure. It has a URL in Azure. And what then happens is the client authenticates to Azure, or Azure, I can't say, I have to say Azure, sorry, right? And you can use any of the authentication schemes that Azure offers you, multi-factor auth, the phone factor stuff, and all of that good stuff. And then what happens is once they're authenticated through Azure, the connection is tunneled down the outbound connection that was established earlier on, and then proxied from that server on that internal network to the internal Exchange box. There is no direct connection between the client and your Exchange servers on-prem through the firewall from on-prem. Does that sound like magic? It's magic, right? Let me see if I can, I'm just going to see if I can quickly, just for fun, I'm going to see if I can show you this. So the way that you do this, yes?
Can we use it for hybrid mode?
Can you use it for hybrid? No, not currently. But we are having some interesting discussions about that. So let me just quickly show you how we set this up, right? And I'm going to probably run a few minutes over, but hey, such is life, right? So I log into Azure. My password, in case anyone wants to know, is a series of circles. Just there on the screen. Sorry? Oh, crap noodles. Hang on. Right. Is it not? Oh, that's funny. Oh, I know why. Hang on. Going to have to end there. Oh, I'm not sure you can see this. Hold on, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Okay, because I'm a little... tell you what I'm going to do. I'm just going to run through a couple of screenshots for it, because now this is fun. So here's what you do. You can see it now, yes? All right, this is Azure. Welcome to Azure. So the first thing you do within Azure, log into Azure, Active Directory, go into the Active Directory settings, and we go into, where are we here? So I'm just trying to look at where I have. So I was planning on showing you this. So this is where you end up in the Azure AD directory stuff. So you go to users, and we create the users in Azure. Now, you can do this through the DirSync process, or you can use ADF, with ADFS, auth, you can do this. You can just create users here if you want to. That just works fine too. Okay, then we go into the configure section. Now, once you go into the configure piece, you scroll down a bit, you'll find this very interesting little box in the middle here. It's called Application Proxy, Enable, Disable, and there's also a little box here that shows View Connectors. Now, when you click Enable, you are turning on the Web Application Proxy feature, if you like, within your Azure AD tenant, and you can see these active connectors. Now, these active connectors, you can have more than one. You can have multiple connectors coming up, and Azure will load balance between them for you. You then install the connector, and it's a small 5 meg download. You install the connector on the 2012 R2 box inside the network, and progress goes by. You enter some credentials for the administrator of your tenant. You need to have premium for the administrator, is my understanding, and then it becomes available to you. Then what you have is the application itself. Now, the way you configure an application is you give it a host name. And in my case here, I gave it a host name of mail. And it will create a URL for you in the Azure namespace. There's no need to put a certificate, though you can. You can actually also use custom domains in here too. So you could have custom domains, DNS, point it to Azure, mail.fabricam.com actually leads to an Azure URL. That's kind of cool too. So you create an application. Now, if you look a little further down there, you'll see the internal URL is the internal URL of your Exchange environment. And so whatever namespace that will be, in my case, in my server here, it was just a single box that I had set up inside Microsoft's corporate network in a test environment, which I can guarantee you cannot be reached from the internet. Okay? I install a connector on a test box, establish a connection to Azure. There's also some settings at the bottom here, and in fact a third one appeared yesterday when I was playing with a live demo, which you can use to determine whether people will be using multi-factor auth or not. So all the Azure multi-factor auth stuff, phone factor and stuff, you can enforce, and you can enforce them from location. So when they're outside the network, and I'm pressing this, based on the determination of your network configuration here, you force them to use multi-factor. When they're inside, they don't. Okay? Now then, here's the user experience. So the user goes to mail.my application name that I decided to publish in Azure WAC OA, and they get application to there's the mail application. And they log in with their credentials. Now at this stage, it's the Azure AD identity, which could be ADFS linked back to your on-prem environment, so it's all the same, or DirSynced with password hash and whatever you want to do. But essentially, they provide their credentials, and they go through any multi-factor auth hoops that you've asked them to jump through. And then they get OA. And in fact, they don't even get this forms-based auth page if you want to configure Kerberos-constrained delegation as well on-prem, because you'd actually get them single sign-in logged in. But here's the most important thing. Look at the URL. URL is not an internal namespace that can't be reached. The URL being used here, okay, it's a silly domain name based on my Microsoft account, but that could be a custom domain too. You're accessing this over the internet. You are not accessing this from inside the network. Pretty cool. Think about it as an interesting solution. I just want to throw that one out there. And so essentially here's the user experience piece which I talked through. Now the key thing at the bottom, so I just talked you through that. That's how the connection works. And so we'll wrap up, I'm saying we'll wrap up because I'm being told to wrap up, right, there you go. Connection comes back through the connector, reverse proxy back through, user gets access to the application. Now, there's a session that actually happened yesterday at 3:15 about enabling this, so you go look at the recording. Unfortunately, this session's after that one, so go look at the recording. So I'm going to wrap up with just a quick summary here, right? So the answer to some of these complex problems, I don't think there's one answer necessarily for all of these. There are several ways to skin a cat in this game, right? And maybe it's a combination of things that you need to put in place. But think about making sure that the requirements are valid, make sure that the two-factor auth versus a solution are discussed, and look at how the risk profile is really understood and analyzed. And don't be afraid to push back on these guys as well. The MFA stuff, the modern authentication piece, is definitely the direction we're moving in. So make sure you see Jono's session on modern authentication, because I think that will solve a lot of these issues in the first place. But hopefully this at least gave you a few ideas as to things you can do in the meantime with the technology that's available to us today. And on that note, don't forget to look at the TAP if you haven't already. I'm wondering who's at the back from the TAP program. Absolutely none of the guys who work in my team. That's absolutely disgraceful. So, but listen, thanks for coming. I hope it was useful, informative, and you had a bit of a giggle. So, thank you.